What's up, y'all? As always, welcome to the channel. So over the weekend, I caught a little bit of a head cold, so bear with me. But today is Juneteenth, at least in North America, a time of remembering the righting of many grievous wrongs in the nation's history. With that on the mind, I was reminded of a very similar stain on the history of Seventh-Day Adventism that the Adventist Church and her apologists refused to put the OxiClean on. In Ellen White's Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, she wrote what might be considered some of her absolute worst statements. I want to remind you that she claimed that her words in her books are barricaded by a "Thus saith the Lord," that she never wrote a single sentence of heresy, that what is contained in her writings was not of her own origin, but what she received from God, and the Adventist Church stands by this. Starting on page 63, she begins giving reasons why God had to flood the earth, namely the depth of depravity that man had fallen into. She mentions things like polygamy, violence, and increased wickedness. But then she states what was the chiefest of sins above all others on page 64, the final straw that sent God over the edge, so to speak. She writes, "If there was one sin above another which called for the destruction of the race by the flood, it was the base crime of amalgamation of man and beast, which defaced the image of God and caused confusion everywhere." So the inspired pen gives us inspired details about why God exactly flooded the earth, and it was because man and beast amalgamated. This has rightfully caused many to wonder what in the world she was thinking and what exactly is being said. Is she saying that humans had sexual relations with animals and produced offspring? And how in the world is that even possible? In 19th century America, there was a belief among many that the black race was subhuman, often referred to as beasts. This became cultural thinking of the day that bled into many churches, sadly, where ministers began calling the intermarriage of blacks and whites the sin of amalgamation. Amalgamation was understood to mean race mixing, and beasts was a common vernacular for the black races. This is the time period in which Ellen White wrote this statement. Her words could properly be understood to say that the sin above which all else called for the destruction of the human race by the flood was the white man mixing with other races. But what might be even more disgusting is that Adventist apologists and Adventist leadership have been forced to defend this drivel, essentially defending the idea that God is a racist, because Ellen White claimed that what she wrote was never prejudiced by other individuals. It was what God had revealed to her. In the same book, on page 75, she again mentions this supposed sin of race mixing. She writes, "Every species of animal which God had created were preserved in the ark. The confused species which God did not create, which were the result of amalgamation, were destroyed by the flood. Since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast, as may be seen in the almost endless varieties of species of animals and in certain races of men." So she says that God did not create mixed race people. They are a confused species. She expounds upon this even further in Selected Messages, Book 2, on page 343 and 44, where she writes this, "But there is an objection to the marriage of the white race with the black. All should consider that they have no right to entail upon their offspring that which will place them at a disadvantage. They have no right to give them as a birthright a condition which would subject them to a life of humiliation. The children of these mixed marriages have a feeling of bitterness toward the parents who have given them this lifelong inheritance. For this reason, if there were no other, there should be no intermarriage between the white and the colored race." And then continuing on to the next page, she says, "In reply to inquiries regarding the advisability of intermarriage between Christian young people of the white and black races, I will say that in my earlier experience, this question was brought before me, and the light given me of the Lord was that this step should not be taken, for it is sure to create controversy and confusion. I have always had the same counsel to give. No encouragement to marriages of this character should be given among our people. Let the colored brother enter into marriage with a colored sister who is worthy, one who loves God and keeps his commandments. Let the white sister who contemplates uniting in marriage with the colored brother refuse to take this step, for the Lord is not leading in this direction." Again, the supposed messenger of God says that race mixing subjects one to a life of humiliation and bitterness. It gives your mixed race children an inheritance of lifelong humiliation, and it's not something God leads anyone to do. As if this wasn't bad enough, the Adventist Church has also been forced to defend a statement by Adventist pioneer Uriah Smith, who, in his book titled The Visions of Mrs. E.G. White, A Manifestation of Spiritual Gifts According to the Scripture, comments on these statements from Ellen White, where he wrote the following. "Since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast, as may be seen in the almost endless varieties of species of animals and in certain races of men. This view was given for the purpose of illustrating the deep corruption and crime into which the race fell, even within a few years after the flood, that signal manifestation of God's wrath against human wickedness. There was amalgamation, and the effect is still visible in certain races of men. Mark, those accepting the animals upon whom the effects of this work are visible are called by the vision men. Now we have ever supposed that anybody that was called a man was considered a human being. The vision speaks of all these classes as races of men. Yet in the face of this plain declaration, they foolishly assert that the visions teach that some men are not human beings. But does anyone deny the general statement contained in the extract given above? They do not. If they did, they could easily be silenced by a reference to such cases as the wild Bushmen of Africa, some tribes of the Hottentots, and perhaps the Digger Indians of our own country. Moreover, naturalists affirm that the line of demarcation between the human and animal races is lost in confusion. It is impossible, as they affirm, to tell just where the human ends and the animal begins. Can we suppose that this was so ordained of God in the beginning? Rather, has not sin marred the boundary of these two kingdoms? Uriah Smith, close friend of the whites, understood Ellen's statement to not be referring to man and animal creating some sort of hybrid human, but like mentioned, it referred to race mixing. He even follows it up by rhetorically asking, does anyone deny the general statement? And that anyone who does disagree could easily be silenced by pointing to the African Bushmen, the Hottentot tribes, and perhaps even the Digger Indians of North America. These people were not what God intended the human race to be, supposedly. They were a result of a downgrade, an even deeper plunge into sin. These races caused a blur of distinction between what is human and what is animal, and his support for this was the pen of Ellen G. White. This is dismissed, by the way, by those seeking to defend it by saying that Uriah Smith isn't Ellen White and she never wrote that she approved of Smith's claims. One such example of this is from EllenWhiteDefend.com, who gives the following defense. At no time did Mrs. White offer any comment on the matter. James White spoke approvingly of Smith's book, defending Mrs. White against 52 objections, but it would be a bold assumption to conclude from this that he agreed with every detail of every explanation and defense that Smith presented. See James White's approving paragraph in Review and Herald, August 25, 1868. In the chapter The Image Beast and 666, we noted that James White approved, with apparently no qualification, a certain prophetic chart, but later, and in another connection, he gently ridiculed a point of prophetic interpretation that is reflected in one statement in the chart. Now, if we are not warranted in drawing from James White's approval of Smith's book the conclusion that he specifically endorsed Smith's statement on amalgamation, we are even less warranted in concluding from James White's approval that Mrs. White approved. Mrs. White's silence proves nothing. Only rarely did she make a statement regarding the accuracy or inaccuracy of explanations made by others concerning her writings. So because Ellen White never vocalized that she supported Smith's claim, it can be ignored as a faux pas statement made by one of the SDA pioneers and nothing else, right? What they failed to mention was that James and Ellen sold thousands of copies of Smith's book, which is the equivalent of putting one's stamp of approval on it. They even mentioned the August 25th Review and Herald article where James White states that he carefully read the manuscript of the book, but conveniently decided to leave that part out. He said, "The association has just published a pamphlet entitled The Visions of Mrs. E.G. White, a Manifestation of Spiritual Gifts According to the Scriptures. It is written by the editor of the Review and Herald. While carefully reading the manuscript, I felt grateful to God that our people could have this able defense of those views they so much love and prize, which others despise and oppose." So despite stating that he read the manuscript carefully, the defense is that the Whites didn't necessarily agree with everything contained within. Let me ask you, if someone wrote such a statement in a manuscript that you carefully read, would you be eager to go sell thousands of copies and make money off of it, tacitly giving your stamp of approval on it? The Adventist Church is ashamed of this part of their history, but only in so much as it tarnishes their reputation. For example, there were other statements along these same lines that were taken out of one of Ellen's most popular books, Patriarchs and Prophets. In Selected Messages, Book 3, on page 452, Ellen's son Willie White, responding to claims about statements being removed from the books by Ellen herself, defended it this way. In all questions of this kind, you may set it down as a certainty that Sister White was responsible for leaving out or adding to matters of this sort in the later editions of our books. Sister White not only had good judgment based upon a clear and comprehensive understanding of conditions and of the natural consequences of publishing what she wrote, but she had many times direct instruction from the angel of the Lord regarding what should be omitted and what should be added in new editions. So like usual, we have the blame being shifted from Ellen to God. It's his fault that Ellen wrote what she did because he's the one that told her to do it, but then apparently changed his mind later on. Why did God supposedly have her write it in the first place, such that it needed to be removed? Why didn't he instruct her to also remove the statements that we read in Spiritual Gifts? Why is God being saddled with a 19th century Western racist mindset? These are the lengths that they will go to uphold the validity of Ellen White and her supposed prophetic gifting, and it's shameful. But more importantly, where does Scripture say that race mixing was the chiefest of sins that led God to flood the earth? Or that it is a sin at all, for that matter? Where does the Bible teach that certain races of individuals have the image of God marred within themselves as a result of their skin complexion? How ridiculous. Furthermore, if this is the sin that caused the flood, shouldn't the SDA Church be shouting it from the rooftops, warning the world? I know many mixed-race Adventist families. Why aren't they being warned of their grave sin and that their children are going to be bitter, confused, and humiliated? Because deep down, the Adventist Church knows it's not true. That's why. But they can't bring themselves to admit that Ellen was wrong. At the end of the day, they're caught in a catch-22. If they admit she was right, God is a racist. If she was wrong, that opens the floodgates to continue asking what else she was wrong about. And that's the question they don't want you asking. If you found today's video helpful, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you can be notified when content like this is uploaded. As always, we'll catch you around next time. God bless.